Welcome, class. This is night 1, session 1 of Hermeneutics. Before we get started, I'm just going to give you guys kind of the explanation on how the assignments are going to go. So rather than have weekly quizzes or papers or anything that you're used to, you actually have a work study sheet that goes with each chapter of the book, and those are already uploaded. So kind of like Pastor Mark's when he did Studying the Bible on Purpose, and you got to just work through these sheets and answer some questions. These study sheets utilize things that you'll learn through our sessions and through the chapters, and you just get to go ahead and put some of these things to practice or find the answers in the book. So what that means is the faster you go through the book, the faster you can have those done. You can run through all those sheets. The only limit is how fast you read through the book. So go through that however you'd like. For undergraduate students, there is a resource called Putting It to Practice. If you're a graduate student, then that is actually in lieu of your research paper. So that's more of an in-depth worksheet that will take everything that we've covered in the class and has kind of truncated it to an abbreviated form to where you can kind of walk through that process A to Z, take a favorite passage of scripture, and then just answer the questions that you see, and allows you to dive into it deeper. And it's kind of just a blueprint to help you get there. And then for the undergraduates, it's just a fun resource if you want to take it home and use it for your own study. Not a requirement, but just something you can use. And then, as usual, you'll have your class participation stuff for credit. So if you're watching this, then you'll need to go ahead and put in your comments on the videos to get your credit. And other than that, the class is very straightforward. It's pretty much just the worksheets and class participation. So just getting to have some fun and work on stuff. Yeah. So without further ado, we will jump into it.
So just to be clear, our class
Yes.
participation is just showing up at this point for us in
Yeah, class participation is attendance.
oh, okay.
It typically is, and then at times different instructors will tack on
Right.
different things of like, I want you to attend, I want you to say something.
Yeah.
Yeah, in class. I don't want you to just sit in the back and stare at me, But I know the crowd that I have, and I'm like, you guys are all talkers and ask questions and whatnot, So, yeah, I'm not going to pressure people into talking either, because I know some things just hit and you got to think about it for a minute. So,
Right.
that's always my joke whenever I've had to do something online to the students. I've said like, all right, like anything, and if no one says nothing, I'm like, hey, I get it. Sometimes you just got to think about it. And that's normally my segue. All right, so hermeneutics. In the area of hermeneutics, the primary question it aims to answer is, how do we understand the meaning of someone else's words? Because that is the main question. That's the angle that this study approaches. And when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because the Bible was written by not only different people that we never knew, to know their personality, anything like that, then you take it back to this was written thousands of years ago. So hermeneutics attempts to reconcile, we can see the words and we know what we have today, but now we're really trying to understand, what did they mean? What was the author's intention behind what they said? Which is a very, very fun idea of a study. So when you're studying any subject, there's typically 4 kind of stages that you can think about to it. The first is recognition of an area that is important and relevant but not fully explored. So when you put that, the idea is, you're looking at an array of things, and you've probably seen this before if you've been looking for books or if you've been doing stuff in a class, where here's this topic and I can see like all these things, but no one's talked about this yet. I don't see anything about this. Hermeneutics is saying, okay, no one's talked about this yet, so I'll do it. Let's figure out how to pull this out. We do a lot of this for what we do at ECCU when it comes to writing these classes. So when it comes to that recognition, your aim is to identify what knowledge is unexplored. So you can tell, you can read the Bible and you can read a passage where everything makes sense, but you see, you know what? Even if you're reading the footnotes, they didn't address this. What's this? That's step 1, is recognizing, I see something right there. What's back there? Second is articulate principles of investigation, and that's just a fancy way of saying that as you begin to gather your data, now that you begin to recognize it, it's now coming up with a way to organize and explain what you found. I had some fun with this, and because we use the term mining things, out of the word, I created a complete mining analogy to these 4 steps just for kicks. So if you were to have step 1, recognition of an area unexplored, you're in a mining tunnel, and you can see everybody mining and doing their thing, but there's a wall that hasn't been tapped yet. So that's your recognition. I see a wall that nobody's tapped into yet, and I want to tap into it. So if you're going to start articulating the principles of your investigation, an example would be stories involving faith. So you're starting to look into things, and you can see these are some major themes or broad principles, hence stories involving faith. If you were to scour the Bible, you'd start to, okay, I'm looking for anything that involves faith, and I'm putting it over here in the category faith. So another way for that for you is if you're mining and you're discovering a bunch of gems in the walls. So you're going to start just broadly categorizing these gems. This one's green, that one's red, this one's blue. You're just beginning to sort things and get them to the side because you got to start somewhere. Step or study 3 would be translating those findings into specific skills that can be taught and applied. So you recognized there's something to be found here. You started organizing what you found. That way you can better understand it because you've been organizing it. And now you're figuring out, okay, how can I transform this into something that is a useful skill or something, how can I put this down in such a way I can relate it to somebody else and it makes sense? Because sometimes you can read something, but to then tell somebody about it, you have to break it down further in your mind to be able to articulate it back to somebody. That's why for kicking back to Pastor Mark's class, when he has his students memorize the 66 books of the Bible, and he talks about, if you have to take a video, do a video teaching somebody the 66 books of the Bible. Because in order to teach it to somebody, you have to internalize it so much to be able to teach it that takes you to that next step. Yeah. So using our example of the faith stories, now that you have your broad category of stories of faith, now you could really begin to dig into it and see what makes these different. How is the context different to each of these stories? What about the cause, the people involved? And you begin to compare and contrast each faith story with each other to find out what made things different each time.
Or similar.
Right, or similar. What's the common thread? What makes them different? So you're just taking that broad category and you're digging a little deeper into even more smaller specifics that you can find. So now that your gems in the mine are sorted, now I'm looking into their individual characteristics. I'm looking at things molecular, chemical. I'm going beyond just the immediate that I can see. And then finally, and this last step is something that hermeneutics takes very seriously, is now taking that application a step further and attempting to ask, how does the author want these resources applied? So it's similar to the third step and not all at the same time, because the third step is, all right, I have this data, I have these resources, this knowledge, how do I make it apply? This fourth step goes a step farther and says, how did the author want it applied? Because you're really, again, aiming at the author. Hermeneutics should be very author-focused. And the beginning of this course, we'll walk through some of the history of how hermeneutics came about and look at some different branches, some of which you will clearly see like that looks ridiculous. But it's good to see and know right, wrong, and everything else with it. So with the stories of faith, okay, you'd now know how you're going to apply those.
I had a question.
Yes.
There were 4 stages.
Yes.
Do articulated principles of investigation and investigation from broad principles, are those kind of like number 2? Because there's 5 dots.
Oh, yep.
there.
Yep, that's supposed to be, I believe, that's supposed to be kicked under.
Okay.
So it just wasn't indented.
'Cause that's what I started changing my numbering to, but I wanted to make sure.
Yep. Good catch. Oh, wait, no, sorry. I'm looking at this again. my notes will help this. Okay, so step 1 is recognition, step 2 is articulate, step 3 is investigation, and translation of those is an indent. It's a subcategory of investigation.
Okay, all right, so investigation, translation go together.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
yep. Thank you very much for that. I will edit that tomorrow.
And what was the mining example for number 4? You did the faith example, but not mining. I gotta finish my story out.
Yeah. So yeah, when it got into, now that you've got to the end of it, you have your gems sorted, you've studied them, you know what makes them tick, you know what makes this gem different than this, you know what happens molecularly to this one. Now that you know those properties, now you know, okay, now I know how I can actually utilize and use them for something rather than just, throw them in a bucket and they look pretty.
Gotcha, awesome.
So the bidding begins at 1,000.
Right.
And I don't take anything less than that.
All right.
Right. And then with hermeneutics, there's that angle to the question of what does the author want me to do? So that would be the idea of, whoever put these gems here, creator, what did he want these used for?
That's good.
Is the sharper angle. So naturally, the goal of this course is to gain an understanding of the principles of proper biblical interpretation and to acquire the ability to apply those principles in sermon prep, Bible study, writing, and just in your own life. So you want to learn it and know what to do with it. If you read the intro to your hermeneutics book, you don't have to. Naturally, books are very normal. You can breeze past the intro to chapter 1 or read it. But if you do read it, you'll find that the author talks about the fact that there's a lot of books out there about hermeneutics or about biblical interpretation theory and study, but they don't all get practical. By the end of your book, it will then turn this into steps that you can do. It's full of exercises and examples at the end of each chapter. Your worksheets that you have as assignments have normally sometimes 1 or 2 highlights from those, but there's like 15 to 20 at the end of every chapter. So if you wanted to, you could just go to town and just breeze through which ones seem interesting to you to put these different methods to practice. So the book is meant to be very practical. Why learn something if you're not going to do anything with it?
Yeah,
So-
some people define hermeneutics as both a science and an art. And those two components, you blend them together depending on what you're doing to actually come up with the goal that you mentioned for us. And so it does require not only an intellectual but also a practical ability to apply the principles. And
I'm curious, did you read the slide where it says technical meaning, the science and art? I was curious. Just curious. But no, that's dead on.
Well done.
Well done. So
No, I did not see that.
that's fantastic. I love that. So the origin of hermeneutics, the idea, the word, the concept, comes from the Greek god Hermes, who served as a messenger for the gods, interpreting their communications to the people. So they were viewing him in an ambassador type role. The gods are saying this, I'm going to explain it so you know what the gods want. And the technical meaning we have today would be the science and art of biblical interpretation. Science because there are rules and an orderly system to it, but art because the communication is flexible, especially when it comes to things biblically. It's not a textbook. There's a lot to it. And there's so many different components to the Bible itself. For any of you guys who have taken a class like New Testament or Old Testament survey, you'll see that the Bible has poetry. The Bible has narratives and stories. It has doctrine. It has letters. So that's another reason why hermeneutics is so key, because you need to know what you're reading to know what's the spin. Someone can use the same 2 sentences, and if it's dialogue or if it's a line in poetry, whether that line is literal or not is going to change, most likely. So when it comes to hermeneutical theory, general hermeneutics includes the historical, cultural, lexical, syntactical, and theological analysis, and we'll get into all of those. But general hermeneutics is a study of the rules that govern the interpretation of the entire text. So this is the broad picture of the Bible as a whole. And the way that you apply those rules we mentioned, is going to differ between which genre, if it's allegory, poetry, prophecy, and so forth. The story of the Bible, we know, it has a consistent theme from beginning to end. It's one of salvation and reconciliation and so forth. But each book in each genre is like a chapter to a story. So if salvation, we'll say the salvation message or God's relationship is the story of the Bible, then each book, each genre is its own chapter, which feeds into the main plot but has its own plot. So hermeneutics recognizes there's a main plot that everything's going to be connected to, but everything has its own individual plot to get into also. And they all have their different angles. One's there to inspire, another one to reveal. Some of them are, satire. Other ones are teaching life principles, and so forth. So each chapter has that unique purpose. And then you have examples on top of it. Think about, we've had sermon series where there's a common sermon series and each pastor teaches a different part, or they have the same message. Sometimes we've done it where here's the one standalone message, but we've had 5 pastors teach it at different locations, and they all have a different perspective because they're 5 different people. You'll hear a lot of topics throughout the Bible, but they come from different people and different voices that have different perspectives because they're different people writing about these topics. So special hermeneutics, then that's the study of the same rules, but how they apply to specific genres of parables, allegories, types, and prophecy. So general is just looking at, all right, here's the blanket and the basic forms, and special hermeneutics, it's just how each of the standard sets are applied. So general is talking about general text, special is talking about where text gets different. Hey, that's interesting. Some of these have a fade-in feature, and I have no idea how that snuck in there, because these are copied from another class of mine where that is not a thing, because I normally don't like that thing. Okay. I saw it, and for a minute I thought, where'd the text go? I can see my notes, but it's gone. All right. Things to look into tomorrow. It didn't do that on my laptop. Because I swear I looked at this stuff before I came here tonight. So now going into some of the things that hermeneutics covers. So first one of which being the canon. Some of you guys took systematic theology, so you'll recognize some of these terms. And the book doesn't spend a great deal going into things like the canon because the canon's already been established. Right. It has a general recap of, okay, here's what happened, here's the main points, here's the result. What we care about is the result.
You probably know what the canon is.
What's that?
If you're studying this, I would assume that you know what the canon is.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but to give its definition, the study of canon for anybody who hasn't taken systematic theology yet, or for those of you who are coming in from first year now, the canon is the study of the books that bear a stamp of divine inspiration and those that don't. So canon was the idea of deciding, okay, we believe these are divinely inspired and these are not. We believe, as believers, that was a Holy Spirit guided process to recognize those books, and it's what we have to stand on. Like much else, it's done in faith. But the key questions they were trying to answer for themselves was not even just which books, but which chapters belong to the divine story. Do these have the author's signature? Not even just the earthly author, but God's divine author. Is this person pretending to be Paul? Does this really look like Paul? Is God's backing behind this? And this has already been established. So then you have textual criticism. A nickname for it is lower criticism. And this is the attempt to determine the original wording in a text. So this involves comparing manuscripts. In comparing manuscripts, the textual critic provides us a biblical text that approximates the original writing. So that's attempting to get to, what's the root word, to know what was used back then, to then funnel, are we reading this right? Is this translation using this word to the best of its knowledge? Is there more fuller meaning beyond what I'm reading in my English translation right now? Historical criticism, nickname higher criticism, is the study of the authorship and the audience of that book or chapter and so forth. So you're looking at the date of composition, historical circumstances surrounding it, authenticity, contents, unity. You're looking at, it's very much, here's the context deal. You know, what was happening at the time that this was written? Who was it being written to? And things of that nature. Many scholars journey down this path to question the belief or divinity of inspiration of Scripture. This has led some people to call historical criticism liberalism. So what that means is that most people take this angular approach, looking at the context, thinking that the context is going to disprove the Bible. And they're looking for something wrong. They're looking for where things don't line up, which is sad because they're starting from a belief that the Bible isn't what it says it is. And we'll mention it a couple times in the class that there is a point to study where you will find what you're looking for. If you're looking for flaws and you're looking for where the Bible doesn't line up, then you'll find them. But if you are walking in and you're looking for, I believe that that God was a uniform author and his thumbprint's on all of this and he doesn't contradict himself, then I believe that there's ways that these fit that I just may not see yet or we may not see for 40 years. So the mindset that you have going in, some people would call it bias, and it is to a degree a bias, has a major impact on what you will find. And it's entirely possible to go through and employ historical criticism with that positive assumption of belief. It's just sadly not as common as you'd think it would be. That's where, for a few of you who took my class, The Historical Books of the Old Testament, there was a book that I was looking into as a commentary for that course that I was going to have the students read. And the first couple chapters that it covered for Joshua and Judges were phenomenal. As soon as I got into 1st and 2nd Samuel, it was terrible. I chucked it immediately and said, nope, we're going to write this hardcore. And I got the different set of commentaries and let you guys just use the Bible and had you do things and study on your own because they were bent with an assumption of pretty much every biblical character is a bad guy. And like they come off lucky. I had never seen, like, David is not perfect, and the Bible does not make King David appear to look perfect in any way. He has made an abundance of mistakes, like all of us. But I had never seen him painted so bad a criminal. He looked worse than Saul. He looked like he was ranking up there with Jezebel at one point, and I was sitting there thinking, there are so many assumptions. He did things that were pretty bad, but the issue was they were reading into assumptions. So there's things in the Bible, there's things that I know this happened, I know this didn't happen, and then there's things that I just don't know.
Right.
And the thing is, when you don't know, it's, to me, pet peeve isn't a strong enough of a word. What I struggle with is when there's areas that we just don't know, but they're taught like we know.
Right.
And they were taking anything that was gray, they spun it negative and were like, clearly it is, and they didn't want to talk about it. And I'm like, no, that's not, you can't say that. Because you don't know. You don't know what you don't know. So is that possible? 100%. But don't teach people that it is. To me, that's irresponsible.
Yeah.
So that's that bias of, oh, they're not talking about this. I believe there's a lot of stuff wrong here. Therefore, that's what I see. And when they call it liberalism, it's easy to see. You'll see attached to theology the terms liberal and conservative, but it refers to completely different meanings than what you would see in politics.
Right.
So conservative is essentially traditional, and it holds to tradition and certain structures, where liberal thinking is more loose, progressive, looking for what's new. So to give you a crazy idea of how this works, if you look back at church history, any movement that's new, let's say, to pull a movement off the top of our head, Pentecostal movement, today we would consider the Pentecostal church to be conservative pretty much on the meter. And when you look at things, if you had liberalism over here and conservatism over here, where a church lands on individual issues, you can be all over the place per question, and on average you'll be one or the other. So the Pentecostal church would be considered conservative, but at the time that movement started, they would be considered liberal. because they were breaking away from tradition. They were doing things that were new, that seemed different, taboo perhaps, even though they were holding to the Bible. But at different points in time, things are read different ways. So because of that general bent on historical criticism, to be looking for things that are wrong and changing the Bible, they didn't really mean that. Clearly, this is all different. That's why it can be painted or assumed that it's a more liberal study than a supportive study, but it doesn't have to be. It can 100% be done with the assumption of belief. So this is a word that you'll see a bunch, and it is exegesis. Sometimes exegesis is used as a nickname or a reference to hermeneutics as a whole, but as its own study, it applies the principles of hermeneutics to arrive at a correct understanding of the text. The prefix ex means out of or from, and it's the idea that the interpreter is attempting to derive understanding from the text rather than read meaning into the text, which is eisegesis. So it's the question of what is the text actually saying to me versus what do I want it to say? It's the idea of if you were to go ahead and write a study or do a small group and you believe something about the topic, you can either go in saying, you know what, we're talking about prayer tonight. Let me see what the Bible says about praying in tongues and let the Bible speak for itself. Or you can come in saying, yeah, this is what I believe, and I'm going to find things in context or not that support what I believe and come in already. Whether you let the Bible prove you or you let the Bible teach you is the main difference between the two. Within that, you also then have the study of biblical theology. So biblical theology is the study of divine revelation as given by the Old and New Testaments. So its main question that it focuses on is, how did this specific revelation add to the knowledge believers already possessed at that time? So using Old Testament, if you don't know me, Old Testament tends to be a favorite of mine. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at what's being written in, let's say, 1st and 2nd Samuel, biblical theology is attempting to determine, so based on what everybody knew before, what was new? What hadn't they learned yet? What specific revelations within these books are new that they perhaps didn't know before or didn't fully understand before? So it's specifically looking to kind of the unique features in terms of teaching to each book as they go forward in time through old and new. So it ends up showing the development of the children of Israel, of the church. It shows the development of knowledge over time. So its twin branch is systematic theology. And the two basically just organize the Bible in a different way. Biblical theology organizes it chronologically, while systematic theology organized it topically, which most of you guys were in this class, but I'm going to still read through it for those of you who haven't had this class. So, like biblical theology, systematic theology is organizing biblical data, but this time you're organizing it into logical rather than historical data. So it's topical. You're attempting to place all the information you're finding on a given topic together. That way you can better understand the total picture of God's revelation on this topic. So I'm going to research healing. I'm going to look everywhere, old, new, put it together, and then now I can see this is God's. I'm looking at the picture as a whole of what God meant when he talked about healing versus at this point in time or this point in time or this point in time. And so with the two, biblical and systematic theology, they are complementary fields that together give us a greater understanding than either would alone. Because if you only had topical, you would lose some of the context. And if you only had chronological and you really zeroed in on just this time frame without any connection to anything else, then you'd lose out on some of the total revelation, because if at this point in time, if they didn't know everything yet, then you're missing stuff too. That's why if you've done any deep dives or any classes, pretty much all of our classes, even if it's New Testament focused or Old Testament focused or somewhere in the middle, things are referenced all over the place. Because even if you're teaching in the Old, it's great to be able to pull into reference the New to say, this is still in effect. This is not in effect. This is the more complete picture of something that was foreshadowed now. And same for the new. This stuff was hinted at for thousands of years, and now they finally got it. So even things that we hone in on, you always end up using a mix of systematic and biblical theology most of the time when you're teaching. And it's really helpful when you do because they complete the package. And then we have practical theology. So practical theology utilizes a 3-step process that describes and analyzes a contemporary situation and practices. So things that it's going to look at is the description of a particular situation, in mind. It's going to use the hermeneutical process to arrive at a response to this contemporary situation, and then it will develop an effective strategy for Christian life and practice that speaks to that situation. So to bring that into layman's terms, practical theology is kind of the last step, and this step is really important to hermeneutics in specifics because we believe the Bible's telling us something. We believe the Bible is relevant and it's not just another book. So we're reading the Bible with the expectation that I'm going to learn something about how to handle my life today because of what it says. It says that it's eternal. It says that it is applicable and full of wisdom. So we're coming in with an expectation of it being practical. So the description of a particular situation in mind, they're talking about like a modern, life struggle, like, money, illness, unforgiveness, list goes on. This is a situation in my life, or praying about a job, or anything. It's saying, okay, practical theology says this is something I need an answer to. So it captures, okay, this is the situation in mind. It's going to use the hermeneutic processes we just discussed to then find out what's the Bible's answer to this, and now come up with a strategy to put this answer into effect in this situation. And it's, again, using these processes to come to a real answer versus a biased answer of, here's my situation, and I'd really like to respond this way, so I'm going to find everything that lets me respond this way and says that it's okay. Without, before you even realize things, as a kid, Chris is my brother. He's actually taking classes and stuff here now. It'd be hilarious if you watch this one day. But I remember there was just being funny, in a kid, we would randomly go ahead and open things, in the Bible and pull dialogue and things out of context and just throw into a situation to be like, yep, that's what the Bible says. Just for whatever crazy games, that we were playing, all of a sudden, to go ahead and find. It's the perfect example of Eisegesis. Yeah. And it was just something absolutely silly, that, we were doing. But, hey, we enjoyed the Bible that much, that we could read the Bible like a novel and fun book. So it uses practical theology with that 3-step process. I was just checking something. That almost looks like a repeat, but rephrased a different way.
Yes, doesn't it?
Yep. It's not exactly what that was. That's why the last slide looked funny to me. The slide was the same topic from the previous class, and this slide is my own words, because I was looking at it, and I was ad-libbing on the fly, because I'm like, I don't talk this way. That's why. So
you prefer the second one.
I prefer the second one. If you need to, figure between the two, go with the second one. Yeah. Recap, practical theology is exactly what it sounds like. I'm taking the things that I've learned and I'm applying them to my life because I believe that the Bible speaks into life today. So this is a brief map of the hermeneutical process. Now, not all of these, naturally, you're going to use, and I'm speaking mostly to study of the canon. You don't need to figure out what the canon is every time. You got it. If your Bible has 66 books, if you have 27 Old Testament books, or if you have, 39 Old Testament books, and you have 27 New Testament books, then you probably have the right books. If you've got more or less, and it's not a mini version of this is a packet of just the Psalms. If it's not something like that, and you find that you're missing books or have more books, then you may have to do a study of the canon. You've got your textual criticism, historical criticism, and so on, and so to recap these into layman's terms again, what I mean. So study of the canon, which resources are the authors, which have the author's approval. Little a, author, and big God, author. Textual criticism. What is the most accurate translation? Historical criticism. That's you now determining what is the historical context surrounding this text. What went into it, what was happening around it, what was it addressing. Exegesis. What is the author's intended message? What was the author attempting to say? And then biblical and systematic theology. Now you're categorizing your knowledge either chronologically and with the development of knowledge, or topical, and you're looking at the collection. And then finally, your step of practical theology. Appropriately apply the truths revealed to real life situations. You see this all the time if you're listening to podcasts, sermons. That's the goal. That is the goal of hermeneutics. What did the author say? So that way I know that I'm using this correctly and I can use it to its fullest potential, really. Because I want to know what the author wanted me to use this for. I know that we have a minute or two on the clock. Let me see how long this slide is, because I need water. I thought I had water with me, and I did not. So my throat's starting to get a little dry. But, okay, yeah. This works. So we'll pretty much recap it on this, on the need for hermeneutics. Why? Why go through the study? So the reason is we hear, recite, and we rend understanding spontaneously. So if you read something, you read a page, your understanding usually comes like that. You know exactly what the words mean. Even if there's a word you don't understand, you know what most words mean. You know what the word the, and things of that nature. Like, for example, hopefully everything I've been saying to you so far has instantly made sense in your mind. It's not, so hopefully.
Even some of the words I should know.
Right.
I go through that process like 3 or 4 times before it starts to sink.
And that's why hermeneutics is there, because sometimes you're going to hit something where it's not automatic.
Right.
So what hermeneutics is in a nutshell is it's a blueprint of what your mind already does subconsciously to understand things. So that way when it's not coming immediately, you can walk yourself through what's normally an automatic process so you can still get to the answer. So somebody figured out pretty much the steps of the human brain, how it works and what you need, pretty much figured out this is what I need for understanding, and I will create a blueprint. Over the course of several hundreds of years until they found a good one, but that was the goal. So it is a recorded blueprint of that process. That way you can get through the roadblocks when your understanding isn't automatic. Any questions on anything so far? And feel free, if you guys have questions at any point, we've got the space for discussion questions. That's important because this is something where you'll notice when you read through the book, I've done my best to make sure that what's in here is pretty much, the bullets of what's most important and some, unique facts or things that apply that you may not see, while at the same time still leaving you a reason to read the book. But I would encourage you to really be reading as you go, or even a little ahead if you get there, just so that way if you have questions relating to the book and we haven't talked about it in class, you have a chance to ask it in person or throw it in the group chat. If you're online or you can only attend this class online, by all means, please throw stuff in the group chat. That way we have a chance to address it and you're not in the dark, because the author does a phenomenal job and it honestly is a pretty fun read. It's a deeper subject, but they handle it very, very well. But there are, I'd say probably no more than 10 terms, but at least that I noticed 10 terms that he never explains and assumes that you know this already, that I realized he didn't talk about that. So I did my best to find those and throw them in my notes, but if you find more, throw them in the group chat and we'll talk about it. So we'll end session 1 right there, and we'll be back in a little bit.